He was hopeless and alone on the stretcher when his dog climbed up and did something no one expected. The doctors couldn't hold back their tears. James Sullivan sat by the window of his third-floor apartment, gazing at the park across the street. The late October sun painted the trees in brilliant shades of amber and gold, a beautiful contrast to the gray clouds gathering above. He smiled sadly as he watched a young couple throw a frisbee for their golden retriever. The dog bounded after the disc with unbridled joy, its entire body wiggling with excitement as it returned the prize to its owners. "You'd like that, wouldn't you, Max?" James said, turning to the large German shepherd lying at his feet. At the sound of his name, Max raised his head, his warm brown eyes meeting James's. The dog's tail thumped twice against the hardwood floor, but he didn't get up. Instead, he shifted closer, resting his muzzle on James's slippered foot. Ever since the diagnosis, Max rarely left his side. The apartment phone rang, breaking the quiet moment. James sighed, knowing who it would be. The hospital had been calling daily, checking in, making sure he was following their instructions. As if he had a choice, as if any of it mattered now. "Hello?" he answered, his voice rougher than it had been just a month ago. "Mr. Sullivan, this is Dr. Patel. I'm just checking in to see how you're doing today." James stared out the window again. How was he doing? The honest answer would be that he was dying, and both of them knew it. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. By the time they had caught it, the disease had already spread to his liver and lungs. 6 to 8 weeks, they had told him 4 weeks ago. Now it was more like days. "I'm managing," he said instead. "The pain medication helps." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Are you taking it according to the schedule I provided?" "Yes, doctor." It wasn't entirely true. He had been taking less than prescribed, wanting to maintain clarity of mind for as long as possible. The fog that descended when he took the full dose made him feel even more disconnected from what little time he had left. "And have you reconsidered hospice care? We have an excellent facility." "No," James cut in firmly. "I want to stay at home. Max needs me here." Another pause, longer this time. "Mr. Sullivan, I understand your attachment to your dog, but at this stage, you really should consider. Max stays with me, and I stay with Max. That's final." James knew he sounded stubborn, perhaps even foolish. A 62-year-old widower with no children, putting his final care decisions in the context of his dog's needs. But anyone who knew him understood that Max wasn't just a pet. Since Emily's death 3 years ago, the German shepherd had been his constant companion, his reason to get up in the morning, to keep going when grief threatened to pull him under. Dr. Patel sighed. "Very well, but please, at least allow the home health nurse to visit daily. Mrs. Rodriguez reported that you refused to let her in yesterday." James frowned. He hadn't been feeling well yesterday, the pain particularly bad, and the last thing he had wanted was a stranger fussing over him, asking questions, making notes on a clipboard. "Fine," he conceded. "She can come, but only for an hour, and not before noon." After a few more exchanges about his medication and symptoms, James hung up and leaned back in his chair. Max immediately rose and placed his head on James's knee, those intelligent eyes studying his face with what James could only describe as concern. "Don't worry, buddy," he said, scratching behind the dog's ears. "We're staying together. I promised, remember?" Max had come into their lives as a puppy 8 years ago. Emily had always wanted a German shepherd, and they had finally bought their house with the big backyard she had dreamed of. James had pretended to be reluctant. A big dog meant big responsibilities after all, but secretly, he had been just as excited as she was. They had picked Max out of a litter of 7, a roly-poly ball of fluff, who had immediately toddled over to Emily and climbed into her lap. "This one," she had said, laughing as the puppy licked her chin, "he's perfect." And he had been. Max had grown into a magnificent dog, intelligent and loyal, protective, yet gentle. When Emily was diagnosed with breast cancer, Max had seemed to understand immediately that something was wrong. He had stayed by her side through the chemo treatments, the surgeries, the nights when pain kept her awake. And in those final weeks when hospice had set up a hospital bed in their living room, Max had slept beneath it, only leaving to eat or go outside when James insisted. After Emily died, James had sold the house, too many memories, too much empty space, and moved to this apartment specifically because it allowed large dogs and was across from a park. For 3 years, it had been just the two of them. Their daily walks had become the framework around which James built the rest of his life. Morning walks, evening walks, weekend trips to the dog-friendly beach 2 hours away. Max's needs provided structure, and his companionship eased the loneliness. And now, James was facing the same fate as Emily. The cruel irony wasn't lost on him, but unlike Emily, who had worried constantly about what would happen to both James and Max after she was gone, James had no one to leave Max with. His only brother lived overseas and was allergic to dogs. His closest friends were either elderly themselves or had living situations that couldn't accommodate a large senior dog. James had visited the local animal shelters and rescue organizations, but the reality was bleak for an 8-year-old German Shepherd with arthritis. Most people wanted puppies or young dogs. The shelter workers had been kind but honest. Max would likely spend his remaining years in a kennel, a devastating prospect for a dog who had known nothing but love and family his entire life. The thought of Max confused and alone in a shelter, wondering why James had abandoned him, was unbearable, and so James had made a decision that he knew many would find controversial, even cruel. When the time came, when he could no longer care for himself or for Max, they would go together. The veterinarian's card was in his wallet, one phone call, one home visit, and Max would go peacefully to sleep in James's arms, never having to face abandonment or the cold reality of a shelter cage. James had made the arrangements weeks ago when the diagnosis was still fresh and the pain manageable. Now, as his condition deteriorated rapidly, the decision weighed on him heavily. Was it selfish? Was he projecting his own fears onto Max? Would the dog, despite his age and attachment to James, adapt to a new home if given the chance? The doubts crept in, especially at night when the pain was at its worst and sleep elusive. But then Max would nuzzle his hand or lay his head on James's chest, those soulful eyes seeming to say, "I'm here, we're together." And in those moments, James believed he was making the right choice. A knock at the door pulled James from his thoughts. Max lifted his head, ears perked, but he didn't bark. He rarely did these days, as if understanding that his person needed quiet. "It's open," James called, too tired to get up from his chair. The door swung open to reveal Sarah Chen, his neighbor from across the hall. A pediatric nurse in her 30s, Sarah had moved into the building about a year ago. She and Max had formed an immediate bond, and she often dog-sat when James had appointments or errands. Since his diagnosis, she had been stopping by regularly, bringing home-cooked meals or simply sitting with him for a while, providing human companionship that James hadn't realized he craved until it was offered. "Hey there," she said, stepping inside with a covered dish in her hands. "I made too much lasagna again. Thought you and Max might help me out." It was their little fiction, that she accidentally made too much food, that he was doing her a favor by taking it. They both knew she was checking on him, making sure he ate, but the pretense preserved his dignity. "That smells amazing," James said, and it did. Though his appetite had waned considerably in recent weeks, the rich aroma of tomato sauce and herbs managed to stir a flicker of hunger. Sarah set the dish on the kitchen counter, and moved to the living room, kneeling to greet Max properly. The dog's tail wagged with more enthusiasm than he had shown all day, and he licked her hand in greeting. "How's my handsome boy?" she cooed, rubbing his ears the way he loved. "Are you taking good care of your dad?" "He never leaves my side," James said, watching their interaction with a smile. "Actually, that's becoming a bit of a problem. I'm worried he's not getting enough exercise." Sarah looked up, concern evident in her dark eyes. "Are the walks getting too difficult?" James nodded reluctantly. "We barely made it around the block this morning. My stamina isn't what it was, and the pain—" He trailed off, not wanting to elaborate. "I can take him for longer walks," Sarah offered immediately. "Before my shift or after. It's no trouble." "You already do too much," James protested, though weakly. The truth was, he would be grateful for the help. Max needed his exercise, and James was increasingly unable to provide it. "It's not too much," she insisted, standing up. "Max and I are buddies, aren't we, boy?" At the mention of his name, Max's tail thumped against the floor again. James felt a wave of gratitude wash over him, followed quickly by a pang of guilt. Sarah didn't know about his plan for Max. She had offered several times to take the dog after James was gone. But he had deflected, saying he had arrangements in place, not a lie exactly, but certainly not the whole truth. "Thank you," he said simply. "He'd love that." Sarah smiled, but her eyes remained troubled. "James, I've been thinking, maybe you should consider—" "Let's not have that conversation again," he interrupted gently. "I've made my decisions." She pressed her lips together, clearly wanting to say more but respecting his boundaries. "All right, but I'm here, whatever you need, both of you." After Sarah left, promising to return the next day to take Max for a longer walk, James slowly made his way to the kitchen to heat up a small portion of the lasagna. Max followed, his nails clicking on the hardwood floor. As James waited for the microwave, he looked down at his faithful companion. "What do you think, Max? Am I doing the right thing?" Max tilted his head, those expressive eyes fixed on James's face. In them, James saw only love and trust, unconditional and complete. It both comforted and terrified him. For the first time, a new thought entered his mind. What if there was another way? What if he had been too quick to assume that no one would want Max, that the dog's fate was sealed alongside his own, the way Sarah had looked at Max with such genuine affection? But no, it was better this way, kinder. Max had already lost one person he loved. James wouldn't make him go through that pain again. Would he? The next morning, James woke to find Max's head resting on the edge of his bed, those brown eyes watching him intently. The dog had always been attuned to his moods and physical state, but since the diagnosis, it was as if Max had developed a sixth sense about James's pain levels. On the bad mornings, when James could barely move without wincing, Max would whine softly and fetch the orange prescription bottle from the nightstand, carrying it carefully in his mouth. Today was one of those mornings. Without being prompted, Max disappeared into the bathroom and returned with the pill bottle, placing it gently on the bed beside James's hand. "Good boy," James murmured, his voice rough with sleep and pain. "What would I do without you, huh?" The question hung in the air, more poignant than James had intended. What would Max do without him? The thought circled back, persistent and troubling. After taking his medication and waiting for the edge of the pain to dull, James slowly made his way to the kitchen. Max pressed close to his side, providing subtle support when James swayed slightly. The dog had become adept at this, positioning himself just so, allowing James to steady himself without making it obvious that he needed help. The lasagna Sarah had brought was still on the counter, now with a plastic container beside it. James realized she must have returned last night after he'd fallen asleep and put the leftovers away. It was a small gesture, but it touched him deeply. The idea that someone had moved quietly through his apartment while he slept, caring for him in this simple way, made his throat tighten with emotion. James managed a small breakfast, half a piece of toast and some coffee, before settling in his chair by the window. The day was overcast, the park across the street nearly empty, except for a few dedicated joggers braving the chill. Max sat at his feet, occasionally glancing up at James as if checking that he was still there, still okay. "We've had a good run, haven't we, buddy?" James said softly, reaching down to stroke the dog's head. Max leaned into the touch, eyes half closing in contentment. 8 years. Not enough, but good years. The thought of their time together brought a flood of memories. Max is a gangly puppy, all paws and ears, chasing butterflies in the backyard. Max patiently enduring Emily's affectionate costumes at Halloween. The lion mane had been particularly indignifying, but he had worn it with stoic grace because Emily had laughed so hard when she put it on him. Max sleeping on James's feet during that first terrible winter after Emily died, when the silence of the house had been almost unbearable. The buzzing of his phone interrupted the reminiscence. It was Dr. Patel again. "Mr. Sullivan, I'm calling to confirm that Mrs. Rodriguez will be visiting at noon today." "Yes, that's fine," James replied, suppressing a sigh. The home health nurse was competent and kind, but her visits always left him feeling more like a patient and less like a person. "Good, and I wanted to discuss something else with you." Dr. Patel paused, and James could almost picture the doctor adjusting his glasses, a nervous habit he had noticed during their appointments. "There's a new clinical trial for patients with advanced pancreatic cancer. It's experimental, of course, but the preliminary results are promising. It might buy you some more time." James closed his eyes. More time. The phrase echoed in his mind. More time for what? More time in pain? More time watching his body betray him, growing weaker by the day? More time worrying about Max's future? But then, more time with Max. More walks, even if they were shorter and slower. More evenings with the dog's head in his lap, watching old movies together. More chances to ensure that Max would be cared for properly when he was gone. What would it involve? He asked, surprising himself with the question. He had been so certain that he was done with treatments, done with the hospital, done with hope. "It's an intensive immunotherapy regimen, combined with a targeted drug therapy. You would need to come to the hospital 3 times a week for the first month. There would be side effects, fatigue, nausea, possibly some immune-related complications, but for some patients it significantly slowed the progression of the disease. And my quality of life?" Another pause. "It varies. Some patients report feeling better overall as the treatment begins to work. Others find the side effects challenging. It's a personal decision, James." The use of his first name, unusual for the formal Dr. Patel, wasn't lost on James. It was a subtle acknowledgement of the gravity of the choice before him. "Let me think about it," James finally said. "I'll let you know tomorrow." After hanging up, James sat silently, his hand absently stroking Max's fur. The dog seemed to sense his turmoil, pressing closer to his leg, offering silent comfort. A clinical trial, the possibility of more time. It was something he hadn't allowed himself to consider, having accepted his fate with a resignation born of watching Emily's battle. She had fought so hard, endured so much, only to slip away despite all the treatments, all the pain, all the hope. But this wasn't just about him. It was about Max, too. And maybe, just maybe, about Sarah, whose kindness had created a small crack in the wall he had built around himself since Emily's death. The sound of keys in the lock made both James and Max look up. Sarah entered, dressed in scrubs, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "Morning," she called cheerfully. "I've got an early shift today, so I thought I'd take Max for his walk now, if that works for you." Max's ears perked up at the word walk, and he looked between Sarah and James, his tail beginning to wag hopefully. "That would be wonderful," James said, grateful for the distraction from his thoughts. "His leash is by the door." Sarah studied him for a moment, her nurse's eyes missing nothing. "Are you okay? You look like you've got something on your mind." James hesitated. He wasn't used to sharing his thoughts, his fears. After Emily died, he had retreated into himself, finding it easier to be alone with his grief than to try to explain it to others. But something about Sarah's direct gaze made him want to talk. "Dr. Patel called. There's a clinical trial. He thinks I might be a candidate." Sarah's eyes widened slightly. "James, that's potentially great news. Are you considering it?" "I don't know." He looked down at Max, who was now sitting alertly, sensing the shift in the conversation's tone. "I had made my peace with things, with the end. Starting to hope again feels dangerous." Sarah moved further into the room, sitting on the edge of the couch closest to his chair. "Hope is always a little dangerous," she said softly, "but sometimes it's worth the risk." "Emily hoped," James said, the words barely audible. "She fought so hard, tried every treatment, and in the end—" "I know." Sarah reached out, briefly touching his hand. "But every case is different. Every person is different." James nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The simple human contact, her fingers warm against his skin, had sent an unexpected surge of emotion through him. "Think about it," she continued. "That's all. Just think about it. And in the meantime, Max and I are going to have a great walk, aren't we, buddy?" At the mention of his name, Max stood, his tail wagging more enthusiastically now. Sarah clipped the leash to his collar and gave James a reassuring smile. "We'll be back in about an hour. Call if you need anything." After they left, the apartment seemed eerily quiet. James remained in his chair, watching the park through the window, but his mind was elsewhere. The clinical trial, the possibility of more time, the realization that perhaps he wasn't as ready to leave this world as he had thought. His gaze fell on a framed photograph on the side table. It was one of the few he had kept after selling the house. Emily on their 10th anniversary, laughing at something James had said, her eyes bright, her face still full and healthy before the cancer had stolen both. Max was in the photo too, photobombing them with typical canine exuberance, his tongue lolling out in what looked remarkably like a smile. Emily had fought, not just for herself, but for them, for James, and for Max. She had wanted every possible day, every possible moment. Even at the end, when the pain was constant and the treatments had failed, she had found joy in small things. The sunlight through the window, a favorite song on the radio, Max's warm presence at her side. What would she think of his decision to give up? To take Max with him? The question pierced him with sudden clarity. She would be horrified. Emily, who had loved life so fiercely, who had cherished every sunrise she was given, she would never understand his choice to cut short not only his own life but Max's as well. And what about Sarah? If she knew what he was planning, would she still look at him with that warm concern? Or would her eyes fill with judgment, with disbelief that he could make such a choice for a healthy dog who had years left to live? James closed his eyes, suddenly exhausted by the weight of his thoughts. The pain medication was making him drowsy, and he felt himself drifting toward sleep. But before he surrendered to it completely, a decision crystallized in his mind. He would call Dr. Patel tomorrow. He would agree to the clinical trial. Not with any great hope for a cure, he was too realistic for that, but for the chance of more time. Time to find a proper home for Max. Time to ensure that his faithful friend would be cared for, loved, protected after he was gone. It was the right thing to do. The only thing to do. For Max, for Emily's memory, and perhaps, just a little bit, for himself. The hospital corridor was too bright, too sterile, too full of memories that James would rather forget. He sat stiffly in the uncomfortable plastic chair, waiting for his name to be called. Max lay at his feet, wearing the service dog vest that Dr. Patel had arranged for him. Technically, Max wasn't a trained service animal, but the doctor had pulled some strings, understanding that James would be more cooperative with treatment if his canine companion was allowed to accompany him. "Mr. Sullivan." A nurse in blue scrubs appeared at the doorway, clipboard in hand. "We're ready for you now." James rose slowly, steadying himself with the cane he had recently begun using. Max stood with him, pressing close to his leg as they followed the nurse deeper into the oncology ward. The dog's presence drew smiles from staff and patients alike, a rare bright spot in an environment dominated by worry and illness. The treatment room was small but private, with a reclining chair for patients and a monitor displaying vital signs. A window overlooked the hospital garden, currently bare with winter approaching but still providing natural light. The nurse, her badge read Lily, helped James settle into the chair while Max positioned himself beside it, alert but calm. "First time for immunotherapy?" Lily asked as she prepared the IV line. James nodded. "First time for any treatment, actually. I wasn't going to..." He trailed off, not wanting to explain his previous resignation to his fate. Lily seemed to understand anyway. "Well, I'm glad you decided to give it a try. Dr. Patel is very optimistic about this trial." James looked down at Max, who was watching the nurse's movements with interest. "I had a good reason to reconsider." Lily followed his gaze and smiled. "He's beautiful. German Shepherd?" "Yes, his name is Max." "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the dog. "Of course." Lily extended her hand, allowing Max to sniff it before she gently stroked his head. "Hello, Max. You're taking good care of your dad, aren't you?" Max leaned into her touch, his tail sweeping the floor in a slow, dignified wag. "How long have you had him?" 8 years, James replied, watching their interaction. "He was my wife's dog originally, but he adopted me pretty quickly." "Was?" Lily asked, catching the past tense. "She died. Cancer, ironically enough." The words no longer caught in his throat the way they once had, though the ache remained, a dull, familiar presence. "I'm sorry," Lily said, her eyes softening. "That must make this even harder for you." James nodded, not trusting himself to speak further. He'd seen what cancer treatment had done to Emily. The nausea, the fatigue, the way her body had seemed to shrink a little more with each hospital visit. The thought of going through that himself, even with the hope of buying more time, was terrifying. As if sensing his distress, Max whined softly and placed his head on James's knee. The weight and warmth were immediately comforting, grounding James in the present moment. He took a deep breath and nodded to Lily, who had prepared the IV. "I'm ready." The first treatment was surprisingly anticlimactic. The IV drip took about an hour, during which Max remained vigilant beside James, occasionally checking the door when someone passed by but never leaving his post. Lily came in periodically to check the IV and James's vital signs, always with a kind word for both man and dog. "You're all set," she finally said, removing the IV line and placing a small bandage on James's arm. "Any questions before you go?" "When will I know if it's working?" James asked, the question that had been hovering at the back of his mind throughout the treatment. "It takes time," Lily replied honestly. "Dr. Patel will want to see you in 2 weeks for scans and blood work. That should give us a preliminary idea of how you're responding." She paused, then added, "The side effects might start tonight or tomorrow. Fatigue is common, maybe some nausea. Call the number on your discharge papers if they become severe." James nodded, gathering his coat and Max's leash. Thank you, Lily. See you on Thursday, she said with a smile. And you too, Max. The journey home was exhausting, though James couldn't tell if it was the treatment beginning to affect him or simply the emotional toll of the day. By the time the taxi dropped them off at their apartment building, he was leaning heavily on his cane, grateful for Max's steady presence beside him. As they entered the lobby, they encountered Mrs. Abernathy from the 5th floor, an elderly woman who always had treats in her pocket for the building's canine residents. Despite his professional demeanor in the service vest, Max's tail gave a hopeful wag at the sight of her. "James, dear," she exclaimed, her voice carrying across the lobby. "I heard you were starting treatment today. How did it go?" News traveled fast in their building, especially among the retirees who treated the lobby as their social club. James had long since given up being surprised by how much his neighbors knew about his comings and goings. "It went fine, Mrs. Abernathy. Thank you for asking." "And how's our handsome boy?" she cooed, already fishing in her pocket for a treat. She looked at James questioningly, seeking permission. "He can have one," James said, smiling despite his fatigue. "He's been very good today." Max accepted the treat with gentlemanly restraint, taking it carefully from Mrs. Abernathy's gnarled fingers. The old woman beamed at him, then turned her attention back to James. "Sarah asked us to keep an eye out for you," she confided. "She said you might need some help these next few days." Of course she had. Sarah seemed to have appointed herself his unofficial caretaker, a role that James found both touching and slightly embarrassing. At 62, he had never expected to need looking after, especially not by someone nearly half his age. "I'll be fine," he assured Mrs. Abernathy, "but thank you." By the time they reached their apartment door, James was sweating and shaking slightly from exertion. Max whined softly, pushing his nose against James's hand in concern. "I'm okay, buddy," James murmured, fumbling with his keys. "Just tired." Inside, he barely managed to hang up his coat and remove Max's service vest before collapsing onto the couch. Max immediately jumped up beside him, something he was usually not allowed to do, and pressed against James's side, his warm body providing comfort that no human touch could match. James didn't have the heart or the energy to push him off. Instead, he wrapped an arm around the dog's sturdy frame and closed his eyes just for a moment. He woke to the sound of a key in the lock. Disoriented, he glanced at the window and was surprised to see that it was dark outside. How long had he slept? Max was still pressed against him, but the dog's head was up, ears alert to the sound of the door opening. Sarah appeared carrying 2 bags of what smelled like Chinese food. She stopped short when she saw James on the couch, her face registering surprise and then concern. "Hey," she said softly. "I didn't mean to wake you. I brought dinner." James struggled to sit up, embarrassed to be caught napping like an old man. Max reluctantly moved aside, jumping down from the couch to greet Sarah properly. "What time is it?" James asked, his voice rough with sleep. "Almost 7, Sarah replied, setting the bags on the coffee table and kneeling to ruffle Max's fur. "How are you feeling? How did the treatment go?" "Tired," James admitted, "but otherwise okay. For now, at least." Sarah nodded, understanding in her eyes. "The fatigue hits hard at first. Your body's fighting a war on 2 fronts now, the cancer and the treatment. It needs rest." James watched as she moved efficiently around his small kitchen, pulling plates from the cabinet and utensils from the drawer. She knew where everything was, he realized. In the weeks since his diagnosis, she had become as familiar with his apartment as he was. "You don't have to do all this," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the food and the careful way she was arranging everything. Sarah paused, turning to look at him directly. "I know I don't have to. I want to. That's what friends do, James. They take care of each other." Friends. The word caught him off guard. When had this young woman, his neighbor of barely a year, Become his friend? When had he allowed anyone to get close enough to claim that title? Besides, she continued, resuming her preparations, Max would be disappointed if I stopped bringing him treats. As if on cue, she produced a small container of plain chicken from one of the bags, setting it on the floor for the dog. Max looked to James for permission before delicately accepting the offering. "Thank you," James said quietly, the words encompassing more than just the dinner or the dog sitting. "For everything." Sarah met his eyes for a moment, a smile warming her features. "You're welcome. Now eat something before it gets cold." They ate in companionable silence, Max settling between them on the floor, occasionally glancing up hopefully for another morsel. The normality of the moment, sharing a meal, the dog at their feet, created an illusion of wellness that James found himself clinging to. For this brief interlude, he wasn't a dying man. He was simply having dinner with a friend. "Dr. Patel says I should know in a couple of weeks if the treatment is working," he finally said, breaking the silence. Sarah nodded. "That's standard. They'll do scans, check your tumor markers." "What if it doesn't work?" The question slipped out before he could stop it, voicing the fear that had been hovering at the edges of his mind all day. Sarah set down her fork, considering her answer carefully. "Then we adjust. Try something else. Take it one day at a time." James looked down at Max, who had rested his head on James's foot, a habitual point of connection between them. One day at a time. It was both the simplest and the most difficult approach to his situation. "I need to find someone to take Max," he said suddenly. When, I need to know he'll be okay." Sarah's expression softened. "James, no, please. I need to say this. I almost made a terrible mistake. I was going to..." He couldn't finish the sentence, shame washing over him at the thought of what he had considered doing to his faithful companion. "What?" Sarah prompted gently. James shook his head. "It doesn't matter now. What matters is making sure Max has a good home when I'm gone. Someone who will love him, understand him." Sarah reached across the table, her hand covering his. "We'll figure it out, I promise. But right now, the focus is on your treatment, on giving you more time." More time. The phrase echoed his earlier thoughts. More time with Max. More time to ensure the dog's future. More time to experience small pleasures like this. A shared meal, a friendly touch, the comforting weight of Max's head on his foot. For the first time since his diagnosis, James allowed himself to feel something like hope. The first week of treatment hit James harder than he had anticipated. The nausea arrived on the second day, a rolling, persistent discomfort that made eating nearly impossible. The fatigue deepened, turning simple tasks like showering or making a cup of tea into exhausting ordeals. By the third day, he could barely get out of bed without assistance. Through it all, Max remained his constant guardian. The dog seemed to have developed an intuitive understanding of James's new limitations. When James struggled to reach the bathroom, Max would position himself just so, providing a living support for James to lean against. When the nausea was at its worst, Max would lie quietly beside the bed, his presence a comforting anchor in a world that had become a swirl of discomfort and medication. Most remarkably, Max had somehow learned to recognize the early signs of nausea before even James was fully aware of them. The dog would whine softly and paw at James's leg, giving him just enough warning to reach for the anti-nausea medication or a basin. This uncanny awareness had saved James from several embarrassing incidents, a small mercy in a situation that already robbed him of so much dignity. Sarah had taken to stopping by 3 times a day, morning, noon, and evening, around her hospital shifts. She would help with medications, prepare simple meals that James might be able to keep down, and take Max for his walks. The German Shepherd had become accustomed to this new routine, waiting patiently by the door at the time Sarah usually arrived. his internal clock apparently as accurate as any watch. On the morning of the 7th day, James awoke feeling marginally better. The nausea had subsided to a dull background sensation, and the bone-deep fatigue had lifted slightly. He managed to get dressed on his own before Sarah's morning visit, a small victory that left him disproportionately pleased. "Look at you," Sarah said when she arrived, genuine delight in her voice. "Dressed and everything." "Don't sound so surprised," James replied, attempting a smile. "I have been dressing myself for over 60 years. And doing a fine job of it," she teased, setting down her bag on the kitchen counter. "You even matched your socks today." Max greeted Sarah with his usual enthusiasm, circling her legs once before sitting politely, waiting for his morning pat. She obliged, kneeling to ruffle his fur and murmur something in his ear that made his tail thump against the floor. "What did you say to him?" James asked, curious about the dog's reaction. Sarah looked up, a mischievous glint in her eye. "That's between me and Max. Guy stuff." Despite his improved condition, James still needed to sit down after just a few minutes of standing. He settled at the kitchen table, watching as Sarah moved efficiently around his space, preparing a light breakfast of toast and tea. "I have a proposition for you," she said, setting the food in front of him, "since you're feeling better today." "I'm listening," James said cautiously, taking a small bite of toast. His appetite had not fully returned, but the toast was plain enough that he thought he could manage it. "I thought we could take Max to the park," Sarah said. "Just for a little while. The fresh air would do you both good, and it's unusually warm today for November." James glanced toward the window. The sky was indeed clear, sunlight streaming in to warm the apartment. It had been over a week since he'd been outside, except for the trips to the hospital for treatment. The idea of sitting on a park bench, feeling the sun on his face, watching Max enjoy the open space, it was surprisingly appealing. "I don't know if I have the energy," he admitted reluctantly. "We'll take it slow," Sarah promised. "And I'll bring the wheelchair from the building's storage room. We can use it if you get tired." The mention of a wheelchair made James wince inwardly. It was another step toward dependency, another reminder of his declining condition. But the temptation of the park, of normalcy, even briefly, was too strong to resist. "All right," he agreed, "but just for a little while." Max, who had been listening to the conversation with perked ears, let out a soft woof at James's words, as if expressing his approval of the plan. An hour later, they were settling on a bench in the heart of the park. The journey had been less taxing than James had feared. The wheelchair, though initially a source of embarrassment, had proven a practical solution. Sarah had pushed him across the street and along the park's paved pathways, with Max walking sedately beside them, still wearing his service vest. Now, with the wheelchair folded and set aside, James sat on the bench, breathing in the crisp November air. The park was relatively quiet on a weekday morning. A few mothers with strollers, some elderly couples walking slowly along the paths, a man throwing a ball for his spaniel in the open grassy area. "Can I let him off the leash?" Sarah asked, nodding toward Max, who was watching the other dog with barely concealed interest. James hesitated. Max was well trained and had excellent recall, but it had been weeks since he'd been allowed to run freely. The service vest and constant vigilance at James's side had become his new normal. "I think he'd like that," James finally said, "just for a few minutes." Sarah unclipped the leash and removed the service vest, setting it carefully on the bench. "Go play, Max," she encouraged, making a sweeping gesture toward the open area. Max looked to James for confirmation, his posture tense with anticipation. "It's okay, buddy," James said. "Go on." The transformation was immediate and joyful. Max bounded toward the open space, his powerful legs carrying him in great, leaping strides. He circled the area once, twice, running for the pure pleasure of movement, his tongue lolling out in a canine grin. The other dog owner, seeing Max's approach, waved in friendly acknowledgement, and soon the German Shepherd was engaged in a spirited game of chase with the Spaniel. "Look at him go," Sarah said, delight evident in her voice. He needed this. James nodded, a lump forming in his throat as he watched his dignified, serious dog revert to puppy-like exuberance. It struck him suddenly how much Max had given up to be his caretaker these past weeks. His exercise, his freedom, his natural dog behaviors all curtailed in service to James's needs. "I've been selfish," he murmured, the realization painful, "keeping him cooped up with me all the time." Sarah turned to him, her expression gentle but firm. "No, you haven't. Max chooses to stay with you. He loves you. But all caregivers need breaks sometimes, even the four-legged kind." James considered her words, watching as Max paused in his play to look back at the bench, checking that James was still there. Satisfied, the dog returned to his game, but the brief check-in spoke volumes about his attachment. "You're a caregiver too," James said quietly, looking at Sarah. "You need breaks as well." A shadow passed over her face, so quickly that James might have missed it if he hadn't been watching her closely. "I'm fine," she said, her tone light. "Besides, Max is much better company than most of my human patients." Before James could press further, Max came trotting back to the bench, panting happily, a stick in his mouth. He dropped it at Sarah's feet, looking up expectantly. "I think he wants to play fetch," Sarah said, picking up the stick. "Is that right, Max? You want to show off your retrieving skills?" Max gave a single bark of confirmation, his eyes bright with excitement. Sarah threw the stick not too far, and Max raced after it, returning triumphantly with his prize. They repeated the game several times, with James watching from the bench, a bittersweet joy filling him at the sight of Max's happiness. Eventually the dog tired of fetch and returned to James's side, pressing against his leg in a familiar gesture of connection. Without thinking, James leaned down to ruffle the dog's ears, murmuring words of praise and affection. "Ready to head back?" Sarah asked after a while, noting James's increasing pallor and the way he leaned more heavily against the bench. James nodded reluctantly. The outing had been wonderful, a taste of normality, a reminder of simple pleasures, but he could feel his strength ebbing. "I think so. Thank you for this, Sarah. It meant a lot, to both of us." As Sarah helped him back into the wheelchair, James felt Max's eyes on him, steady and concerned. The dog had reverted from his playful state back to vigilant guardian as soon as he sensed James's fatigue. "It's okay, buddy," James assured him, reaching out to touch the dog's head. "I'm just tired. It was worth it to see you have fun." On the way back to the apartment, James found himself thinking about the future, not just his own dwindling days, but Max's years ahead. The dog was only 8, potentially with 5 or more good years left. Years that should be filled with more days like today, running in the park, playing with other dogs, being a dog rather than a nurse. Sarah must have sensed the direction of his thoughts because she spoke suddenly, breaking the silence. "He's a special dog, James. The way he takes care of you, the way he knows exactly what you need before you even ask. I've never seen anything like it." "He was the same with Emily," James replied softly. "During her illness, he just knows." Sarah nodded, her hands steady on the wheelchair handles. "That kind of bond is rare. It's something to cherish." "It is," James agreed, reaching down to stroke Max's head as the dog walked beside the wheelchair. "And it's why I need to make sure he's taken care of when I'm gone." Sarah didn't respond immediately, and James wondered if he had made her uncomfortable by bringing up his inevitable death. But when she finally spoke, her voice was calm and determined. "We'll find the right place for him, James. The right person. Someone who will understand what he needs and how special he is, I promise. The sincerity in her voice eased something in James's chest, a knot of worry that had been present since his diagnosis. For the first time, he truly believed that Max would be okay without him. It wasn't the solution he had originally envisioned, but it was the right one. The only one. As they approached the apartment building, Max trotting faithfully alongside the wheelchair, James felt a peculiar sense of peace settle over him. Whatever time he had left, whether the treatment bought him weeks or months, he would use it well, for Max, for himself, and perhaps in some small way for Sarah too. 2 weeks into the treatment, James sat in Dr. Patel's office, waiting for the results of his latest scans. Max lay at his feet, his calm presence a stark contrast to the anxiety coursing through James's veins. Sarah had offered to come with him, but he had declined. Some news, he felt, was better received alone. The door opened, and Dr. Patel entered, a file in his hands and an unreadable expression on his face. He nodded briefly to James before settling behind his desk. "Mr. Sullivan," he began, his voice measured, "I've reviewed your scans and blood work." James steeled himself for the worst. Despite the punishing side effects of the treatment, he had harbored a small, persistent hope that it might be working. The thought of telling Sarah, of seeing disappointment replace the careful optimism in her eyes, was almost as painful as contemplating his own abbreviated future. "There appears to be a slight reduction in tumor size," Dr. Patel continued, his professional tone giving way to something warmer. "It's modest, but it's a response. The treatment is having an effect." The words took a moment to penetrate James's dread. "It's working?" "Cautiously, yes. I would say it's working." Dr. Patel allowed himself a small smile. "Your tumor markers have also decreased, which is consistent with the imaging results. It's not a dramatic response, but it's significant given the aggressive nature of your cancer." A peculiar feeling washed over James. Not quite relief, not quite joy, but something in between. A reprieve. More time. The very thing he had been hoping for when he agreed to the trial. At his feet, Max stirred, sensing the shift in James's emotional state. The dog raised his head, looking first at James and then at Dr. Patel, as if confirming the good news for himself. "What does this mean?" James asked, finding his voice. "In terms of time." Dr. Patel's expression grew more measured. "It's difficult to make precise predictions. If you continue to respond to the treatment, it could potentially extend your life by several months, possibly longer, in the best-case scenario. Months. Not years, not a cure, but months. Still, it was more than the weeks he had been told initially. More time to put his affairs in order. More time with Max. "And the treatment schedule? We continue as before?" Dr. Patel nodded. 3 times a week, with scans every 2 weeks to monitor your progress. We may need to adjust the dosage based on your response and how you're tolerating the side effects. James thought about the past 2 weeks, the nausea, the fatigue, the days when he could barely move from his bed. It had been brutal, but knowing that it was actually making a difference changed the equation entirely. "I understand," he said. "I'm prepared to continue." Dr. Patel studied him for a moment, then glanced down at Max. "Your dog has been a remarkable support from what the nurses tell me. Lily says he anticipates your needs even before you voice them." James smiled, reaching down to stroke Max's head. "He's always been intuitive, more so since I got sick." "Animals often sense things we can't," Dr. Patel observed. "Changes in body chemistry, subtle shifts in behavior. It's quite extraordinary." The conversation turned to practical matters, adjustments to James's medication schedule, strategies for managing side effects, the logistics of his ongoing treatment. Throughout, Max remained attentive, his eyes moving between the two men as if following the discussion. When the appointment concluded, Dr. Patel extended his hand. "I'm cautiously optimistic, Mr. Sullivan. See you on Thursday for your next treatment." The journey home was a blur. James felt lighter, as if some of the crushing weight of his diagnosis had been lifted. Not removed entirely, the cancer was still there, still deadly, but made more bearable by the prospect of more time. In the taxi, he pulled out his phone and sent a simple text to Sarah. "Good news. Tell you when you stop by." Her reply came seconds later. "On my way." By the time they reached the apartment, James was feeling the fatigue that always followed his hospital visits. Max stayed close, offering his sturdy frame for support as James made his way from the elevator to his door. Inside, the dog immediately fetched James's slippers, bringing them one by one to where James had settled on the couch. "Thank you, buddy," James murmured, smiling at this small ritual that Max had instituted since the treatment began. The dog's thoughtfulness never ceased to amaze him. A knock at the door announced Sarah's arrival. Max trotted over to greet her, his tail wagging with more energy than usual, as if he too wanted to share the good news. "What did Dr. Patel say?" she asked without preamble, shrugging off her coat. Her shift had obviously just ended. She was still in her scrubs, her hair hastily pulled back. "The tumors have shrunk," James said, still hardly believing it himself. "Not dramatically, but enough to show that the treatment is working." Sarah's face lit up, a smile transforming her tired features. "James, that's wonderful. I knew it. I just knew the trial would help." She moved to the couch, sitting beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Did he give you a new prognosis?" "Months, potentially, if the response continues." Sarah nodded, absorbing this information with the dual perspective of a friend and a medical professional. "That's significant, especially for pancreatic cancer at this stage." Max had followed Sarah to the couch and now stood before them, looking from one to the other, his tail still wagging gently. James patted the cushion beside him, inviting the dog up. Max jumped up with surprising grace for his size, settling in the small space between James and the armrest. "I think he knows," James said, wrapping an arm around the dog's substantial shoulders. "He's been different since we left the hospital, more relaxed somehow." Sarah smiled, reaching across to stroke Max's ear. "He definitely knows. Dogs are incredibly attuned to our emotional states. If you're feeling hopeful, he picks up on that." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the three of them, man, woman, and dog, connected by the simple shared joy of good news in a landscape that had offered precious little of it lately. "This calls for a celebration," Sarah finally said, standing up. "Nothing wild, I know you're tired, but maybe I could cook dinner here tonight, something special." The offer touched James deeply. "You don't have to do that. You've already done so much." "I want to," she insisted, her expression earnest. "Please let me do this. For all of us." She gestured to include Max, who was watching the exchange with interest. James found himself nodding. "All right, thank you." Sarah's face brightened again. "Great. I need to run to the store. Any requests? Anything your stomach might actually enjoy after all the treatment side effects?" James considered. His appetite had been virtually non-existent for weeks, food becoming merely a necessity rather than a pleasure. But today, with the weight of imminent death slightly lifted, he found himself actually wanting to eat. "Roast chicken," he said, surprising himself with the specificity. "My mother used to make it on Sundays, with roasted potatoes and carrots." "Roast chicken it is," Sarah agreed, already heading for the door. "I'll be back in an hour. You two rest." After she left, James leaned back against the couch cushions, suddenly exhausted. The emotional roller coaster of the day, the anxiety before the appointment, the unexpected good news, the rush of cautious hope, had drained what little energy he had. Max shifted closer, his warm body a comforting presence against James's side. The dog's breathing was steady and deep, a rhythmic sound that James found soothing. Before he knew it, his eyes were closing, sleep pulling him under. He dreamed of Emily. They were in their old backyard, sitting on the patio they had built together, watching a younger Max chase butterflies through the flower beds. Emily was laughing, her face healthy and full, her eyes bright with life. "I'm glad you decided to fight," she said, turning to him with that smile that had always been his anchor. "He needs you, and you need him." But eventually, James began, the knowledge of his diagnosis seeping even into the dream. Emily touched his face, her hand warm and solid in a way that made his heart ache. "Eventually isn't now. Now is for living, James. For both of you." He woke to the smell of roasting chicken and the sound of quiet movement in his kitchen. For a moment, disoriented between dream and reality, he thought it might be Emily. Then Max stirred beside him, and the present reasserted itself. Sarah was at the stove, her back to him, humming softly as she worked. The scene created a strange juxtaposition with his dream. Different woman, different kitchen, different life. Yet there was a similar feeling of home, of being cared for. Max jumped down from the couch and padded over to Sarah, who turned and smiled at the dog, slipping him a small piece of chicken. "That's our secret," she whispered, not realizing James was awake. James watched them, this unlikely pair who had become his support system, his reason to endure the brutal treatments, his connection to a world that he had nearly resigned himself to leaving. The dream Emily's words echoed in his mind. Now is for living. And for the first time since his diagnosis, James felt truly deeply grateful to be alive. As November gave way to December, a cautious routine established itself in James's life. Treatment days, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, were still difficult, leaving him drained and often nauseated. But the days in between had begun to offer small pockets of normalcy. On good mornings, he and Max would take slow walks around the block, James leaning on his cane, Max matching his pace perfectly. On particularly good days, Sarah would join them for brief outings to the park, where Max could run and play, while James watched from a bench, bundled against the winter chill. The apartment had subtly transformed as well. Sarah had brought in a small Christmas tree, setting it up in the corner of the living room with simple white lights and a few ornaments. Nothing too flashy, she had assured him, knowing his preference for understated decor. There were other small touches too, a soft new blanket on the couch, perfect for afternoon naps, a bird feeder outside the window that attracted chickadees and cardinals, providing entertainment for both James and Max. Sarah's books and magazines gradually accumulating on the coffee table, evidence of the increasing time she spent in his space. Most noticeable, however, was the wall of cards that had begun to form on the refrigerator door. Mrs. Abernathy from the 5th floor had been the first, her spidery handwriting expressing delight at the news of his improving condition. Then came cards from other neighbors, from the nurses at the oncology center, even from the doorman who had helped Sarah with the wheelchair that first day at the park. It was as if the building, perhaps the entire neighborhood, was rallying around James's modest medical victory. "You have more friends than you realized," Sarah had observed, pinning up yet another card from someone in the building whom James barely knew by name. The doorbell rang, interrupting James's contemplation of this unexpected community support. Max, who had been dozing at James's feet, lifted his head alertly but didn't bark. He had become accustomed to a steady stream of visitors over the past weeks. "I'll get it," Sarah called from the kitchen where she had been preparing lunch. She wiped her hands on a towel and moved to the door, checking the peephole before opening it. "Lily, come in." James straightened slightly in his chair as Lily, the nurse from the oncology center, entered carrying a small gift bag. Her presence in his home, outside the clinical setting of the hospital, was unexpected. "I hope I'm not intruding," Lily said, looking a bit uncertain. "Sarah mentioned you had a good day yesterday, so I thought I might stop by on my lunch break." "Not at all," James assured her, genuinely pleased to see the nurse who had become a familiar, comforting presence during his treatments. "It's good to see you outside the hospital." Max had risen to greet the visitor, his tail wagging in recognition. Lily kneeled to greet him properly, ruffling the fur around his neck affectionately. "Hello, handsome," she cooed. "Taking good care of your dad?" Max responded with a dignified woof, as if confirming his dedication to the task. "He never leaves my side," James said, watching their interaction with a smile. "Except for walks with Sarah, I think those have become the highlight of his day." "Speaking of highlights," Lily said, standing and offering the gift bag to James, "I brought something for you. Just a small gift from the oncology team." James accepted the bag with surprise. Inside was a framed photograph that made his breath catch. It showed him sitting in the treatment chair, Max at his side, both of them looking out the window. The sunlight streaming in created a soft glow around them, and the bond between man and dog was palpable even in the still image. "Dr. Patel's daughter is a photographer," Lily explained. "She came in to document the new treatment center last week and caught this moment. We all thought you should have it." James studied the photograph, deeply moved by the thoughtfulness of the gift. In the image, he looked frail but peaceful, his hand resting lightly on Max's head. The dog's profile was regal, his posture alert, yet relaxed, a guardian at rest, but ever vigilant. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. This means a lot." Sarah had moved to look over his shoulder at the photograph. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "She really captured both of you." Lily smiled, clearly pleased by their reaction. "Dr. Patel says your latest blood work continues to show improvement. He's very encouraged." James nodded. Each small victory, a slight reduction in tumor markers, an incremental increase in energy, was cautiously celebrated, though he was careful not to let hope carry him too far. The cancer was still there, still deadly. The treatment was buying time, not affecting a cure. But time had become precious in a way he had never fully appreciated before. "Would you like to stay for lunch?" Sarah asked Lily. "I've made plenty." "I would love to, but I need to get back for my shift," Lily replied regretfully. "Another time?" "Absolutely," James said, surprising himself with the sincerity of the invitation. A month ago, he had been retreating from the world, narrowing his circle to just himself and Max. Now he found himself welcoming connections, appreciating the people who had chosen to share this difficult journey with him. After Lily left, Sarah set the framed photograph on the mantel, adjusting it slightly so that the light caught it just right. "It belongs there," she said decisively, "where everyone can see it." James looked at the image of himself and Max, then at Sarah moving efficiently around his kitchen, preparing a lunch he might actually be able to eat today. An unexpected wave of contentment washed over him. His circumstances hadn't fundamentally changed, he was still a dying man, but somehow the quality of his remaining days had been transformed. "Thank you," he said suddenly, the words bursting from him with unexpected force. Sarah turned, a questioning look on her face. "For what?" "For this, for everything, for making these days worth living." Her expression softened, a smile warming her features. "You're welcome, James, but it goes both ways, you know. You and Max, you've given me something too." Before he could ask what she meant, the oven timer beeped, drawing her back to the kitchen. Max, sensing perhaps that the moment called for canine comfort, moved to James's side, resting his head on James's knee in a familiar gesture of connection. As they ate lunch, a simple but delicious soup that Sarah had learned to make during a semester abroad in France, James found himself observing her more closely than usual. There was something he had been meaning to ask her, something that had been nagging at the back of his mind for weeks. "Sarah," he began, setting down his spoon, "why are you doing all this?" She looked up, her spoon halfway to her mouth. "Doing what?" "Taking care of me. Spending all your free time here. You're young. You should be out with friends, dating, living your life, not sitting in an apartment with a dying man and his dog." The words came out more bluntly than he had intended, but the question had been building for so long that there was no gentle way to ask it. Sarah set down her spoon, considering her answer carefully. "When I was 19, my father was diagnosed with ALS," she said finally. "He went from being the strongest person I knew to needing help with every basic function. It happened so fast, and I was away at nursing school, only able to come home on weekends. By the time I graduated, he was gone." She paused, taking a sip of water before continuing. "I always felt like I should have been there more, should have done more. It's part of why I became a nurse, I think, but it's not why I'm here with you. I'm here because I want to be, because you and Max matter to me." The simple sincerity of her words struck James deeply. He had assumed her care stemmed from professional compassion or perhaps pity. The idea that she genuinely valued his company, even in his diminished state, was unexpectedly moving. "Besides," she added, her tone lightening, "Max is the best dog I've ever known. Who wouldn't want to spend time with him?" As if recognizing that he was being discussed, Max lifted his head from where he had been lying beside James's chair, his ears perked forward attentively. James laughed, the sound surprising both of them. "He is exceptional, isn't he? Though I might be biased." The moment of tension dissolved, replaced by the easy companionship that had become characteristic of their relationship. Yet James found himself mulling over Sarah's words throughout the afternoon, particularly as he watched her and Max engaged in their daily ritual of reviewing commands, sit, stay, shake, leave it, exercises that kept the dog's mind sharp and provided a structure to their days. She cared about him, about them. It was as simple and as complicated as that. And in the face of such generosity of spirit, James found his earlier worries about Max's future beginning to resolve into something like peace. When the time came, and it would still come despite the reprieve granted by the treatment, Max would not be alone. He would be loved, cared for, understood. For now, though, they were together, man, dog, and the unexpected friend who had become so essential to both their lives. And for today, that was enough. Christmas Eve arrived with a gentle snowfall that transformed the city into a postcard scene. From his living room window, James watched the flakes drift lazily past the streetlights, accumulating on tree branches and parked cars. Max sat beside him, his nose occasionally pressing against the cold glass when a particularly large flake caught his attention. "Beautiful, isn't it, buddy?" James murmured, reaching down to stroke the dog's head. Max responded with a soft whine, his eyes moving from the snow to James's face as if checking that his human was still doing okay. The dog had been particularly attentive today, rarely leaving James's side even when Sarah was present. It was as if Max sensed something that the humans did not, a subtle change in James's condition perhaps, or simply the emotional weight of the holiday. James had been feeling unusually tired all day. Not the crushing fatigue that followed treatments, but a deeper, more pervasive weariness. Dr. Patel had warned him that there would be good days and bad days, even as the treatment continued to show modest success. Today, it seemed, was one of the less good days. The sound of Sarah humming Silent Night drifted from the kitchen where she was preparing a simple Christmas Eve dinner. She had taken the evening off from the hospital, arranging a swap with a colleague so she could spend the holiday with James and Max. Her own family was scattered across the country, she had explained, and she preferred to be here, with them. James's thoughts turned to holidays past, to Christmases with Emily, their tradition of opening one gift on Christmas Eve, always something small but meaningful, to childhood celebrations with his parents and brother, the house smelling of pine and cinnamon, to the first Christmas after Emily's death, when he had nearly skipped the holiday entirely, only rallying enough to hang a single ornament on a houseplant because he knew Max was watching, somehow aware that something important was missing from their routine. This year was different. Despite his illness, or perhaps because of it, James found himself appreciating the season with a bittersweet intensity. The lights on the small tree Sarah had brought seemed to shine more brightly. The cards on the refrigerator, their messages of hope and encouragement, touched him more deeply. Even the familiar carols playing softly from Sarah's phone carried a poignancy that made his chest ache with a not unpleasant fullness. "Penny for your thoughts," Sarah said, coming to stand beside him at the window. She had changed from her work clothes into a festive red sweater, and her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders. In the soft light of the apartment, she looked younger, less burdened by the responsibilities she shouldered daily. "Just thinking about Christmases past," James replied honestly, "and how unexpectedly nice this one is turning out to be." Sarah smiled, her eyes reflecting the twinkling lights from the tree. "Despite everything?" "Because of everything," he corrected gently. "When you think your days are numbered, each one becomes more precious, even the hard ones." She nodded, understanding in her gaze. "Dinner's almost ready. Do you feel up to eating at the table, or would you prefer the couch tonight?" James considered the question seriously. He had been trying to maintain normal routines as much as possible, eating at the table, dressing properly each day, sitting up rather than lying down when he had visitors. Small acts of defiance against the disease that sought to confine him. But tonight, the couch's softness called to him. "The couch, I think," he admitted, "if that's not too much trouble." "Not at all," Sarah assured him, already moving to arrange pillows and bring over the small folding table they used for such occasions. Max, sensing that dinner was imminent, took up his station near the couch, his posture alert but patient. James settled onto the couch, grateful for its support. The day's unusual fatigue had progressed to a dull ache in his bones, a reminder that despite the treatment's success, the cancer was still present, still working its destruction on his body. Sarah brought over their plates, roast chicken again, which had become something of a comfort food for James, along with mashed potatoes and glazed carrots. The meal was simple but perfect, exactly what his sometimes finicky stomach could handle. "I have something for you," Sarah said as they finished eating. "For both of you, actually. I know we said no gifts, but..." She disappeared into the hallway and returned with 2 packages, one large and one small. She handed the smaller one to James first. "This one's technically for tomorrow, but I thought you might want to open it tonight." James carefully unwrapped the small package to reveal a handsome leather-bound journal, its cover soft and supple under his fingers. "I noticed you writing notes sometimes," Sarah explained. "Just on scraps of paper or in that old notebook. I thought you might like something nicer." James ran his hand over the journal, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. He had indeed been writing more lately, reflections on his life, memories he wanted to preserve, thoughts about the unexpected turns his journey had taken. It was partly for himself, a way to process the complex emotions of his situation, and partly for whoever might come after, a legacy of sorts, modest though it might be. "It's perfect," he said sincerely. "Thank you, Sarah." She smiled, pleased by his reaction, then turned to the larger package. "And this one is for Max. He can open it now." Max's ears perked up at the sound of his name. Sarah placed the package on the floor in front of him, and with a gentle okay from James, the dog began to investigate, his nose working over the wrapping paper. "He might need some help," James said, chuckling as Max pawed tentatively at the package. Sarah knelt beside the dog, helping him tear the paper to reveal a plush dog bed, thicker and more supportive than his current one, which had seen better days. "I noticed his old bed was getting pretty flat," she explained, watching as Max circled the new bed, sniffing it thoroughly. "This one has orthopedic foam to help with his arthritis, and the cover's washable." "It's very generous," James said, watching as Max, having completed his inspection, settled onto the new bed with a contented sigh. "I think it's a hit." Sarah beamed, clearly delighted by the dog's immediate acceptance of her gift. "I was hoping he'd like it. The reviews said even picky dogs usually approve." "Max isn't picky," James observed, smiling at the dog now stretched out luxuriously on his new bed. "He's discerning. There's a difference." They shared a laugh, the warm sound filling the apartment and creating a bubble of normalcy that, for a moment at least, kept the harsher realities at bay. As the evening progressed, James found himself growing increasingly tired. The day's activities, minimal though they had been, combined with the emotional resonance of the holiday, had drained his limited reserves. Sarah noticed, she always noticed, and began quietly clearing away the dinner dishes. "I should probably head home soon," she said, checking the time. "Let you get some rest." James was about to agree when he glanced outside. The gentle snowfall had intensified, and the streets were now covered in several inches of pristine white. "The snow's getting heavy," he observed. "Why don't you stay?" The couch pulls out into a bed. It's not the most comfortable, but it's better than trying to get home in this weather. Sarah hesitated, looking from James to the window and back again. "Are you sure? I don't want to impose." "You wouldn't be," he assured her. "Besides, I think Max would worry about you traveling in this storm. Wouldn't you, Max?" On cue, Max lifted his head from his new bed and gave a soft woof that made them both smile. "Well, if Max insists," Sarah conceded, her expression softening. "Thank you." Later, after Sarah had helped James through his evening routine of medications and settled him in his bedroom, he lay awake listening to the quiet sounds of her preparing the pull-out couch. There was something deeply comforting about knowing she was there, just on the other side of the wall. It had been a long time since anyone but Max had stayed overnight in his home. Max, who normally slept on his old bed beside James's, had chosen to remain in the living room with his new bed. Through the partially open door, James could see the dog stretched out contentedly, positioned so he could see both bedroom and couch, keeping watch over his expanded pack. As sleep began to claim him, James felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. For Sarah's presence, for Max's unwavering loyalty, for the unexpected gift of this peaceful Christmas Eve, so different from what he had imagined when he received his diagnosis. Tomorrow was uncertain, as all his tomorrows now were. But tonight, in this moment, he was not alone. And that, perhaps, was the greatest gift of all. January brought a harsh cold snap that kept James and Max largely confined to the apartment. The brief walks they had managed in December became too risky on ice-slicked sidewalks, especially as James's balance grew increasingly unreliable. Instead, Sarah would take Max for quick outings while James rested, the dog always returning with an anxious energy, hurrying to check on his human as if afraid James might have disappeared during his absence. The treatment continued, though its effectiveness seemed to be plateauing. Dr. Patel had been candid during their last meeting. The cancer was adapting, finding ways to resist the therapy. It wasn't unexpected. Most advanced cancers eventually developed resistance to treatment. But the timing was disappointing, coming just as James had begun to hope for a few more months than initially predicted. "We have options," Dr. Patel had assured him. "We can adjust the dosage, add complementary therapies. The goal remains the same, to buy you as much quality time as possible." Quality time. The phrase had echoed in James's mind throughout the following days. What constituted quality in his current circumstances? Was it the mornings when the pain medication worked well enough that he could make his own tea? The afternoons when Sarah would read aloud from novels they had discovered they both enjoyed, Max a warm weight against his legs? The quiet evenings when the three of them would watch old movies, finding comfort in stories where all conflicts were resolved in 2 hours or less? Or was quality measured in the bigger moments? The day last week when his brother Tom had finally visited from overseas, the awkward distance between them gradually thawing as Tom witnessed the easy rapport between James and Max, between James and Sarah. The video call with Emily's sister, who had wept openly at the sight of Max still faithfully at James's side, saying that Emily would be so proud of both of them. Today had not been a quality day by any measure. James had woken to a pain that sliced through his abdomen like a hot knife, leaving him gasping and disoriented. Max had sensed the crisis immediately, whining and pawing at the bedroom door until Sarah, who had been spending more nights on the pull-out couch than in her own apartment lately, rushed in. The next few hours had been a blur of ambulance lights, emergency room chaos, and the cold efficiency of hospital protocols. Now, as evening settled over the sterile hospital room, James found himself hooked to an IV drip of pain medication, the sharp agony dulled to a manageable throb. "You gave us quite a scare," Dr. Patel said, reviewing the chart at the foot of James's bed. "But it appears to have been a partial obstruction, not a perforation as we initially feared. The scans show it's resolved for now." James nodded wearily, too drained to form a proper response. His gaze drifted to the window, where the early winter darkness pressed against the glass. Somewhere across the city was his apartment, and in it, Max, separated from him for the first time since his diagnosis. "How long do I need to stay?" he finally managed to ask, his voice rough from the breathing tube that had been briefly inserted during the emergency procedures. Dr. Patel's expression softened with understanding. "At least overnight for observation, possibly longer, depending on how you respond to the adjusted pain management protocol." James closed his eyes briefly, steeling himself against a wave of emotion. "Max will be worried." "Sarah assured me she would take excellent care of him," Dr. Patel replied gently. "She seemed very competent." "She is," James agreed, a small smile touching his lips despite his discomfort. "But Max has never been away from me when I'm sick. Not since Emily." Dr. Patel nodded, making a note in the chart. "I understand. Rest now. We'll reassess in the morning." After the doctor left, James lay in the sterile quiet of the hospital room. The only sounds the soft beeping of monitors and the occasional squeak of rubber-soled shoes in the hallway. It was a familiar environment. He had spent countless hours in similar rooms during Emily's illness, but being the patient rather than the visitor created a disorienting reversal of perspective. His thoughts kept returning to Max. How was the dog handling his absence? Was he pacing by the door, waiting for James's return? Was he refusing to eat, as he had in the days following Emily's death? The image of Max, confused and distressed, made James's chest ache in a way unrelated to his physical condition. A soft knock at the door interrupted his spiraling concerns. A nurse he didn't recognize poked her head in. "Mr. Sullivan, you have a visitor, a Sarah Chen. She says she's your neighbor." James straightened slightly against the pillows, hope flickering to life. "Yes, please, send her in." The door opened wider, and Sarah entered, but she wasn't alone. Trotting beside her, Wearing his service dog vest and an expression of intense focus was Max. "How?" James began, his voice cracking with emotion. "Dr. Patel pulled some strings," Sarah explained, moving to the bedside. "He said Max's presence might actually aid your recovery given your bond. It's not standard protocol, but he made an exception." Max approached the bed cautiously, his nose working overtime as he processed the hospital smells. His ears were pinned back slightly, betraying his discomfort with the unfamiliar environment, but his eyes never left James's face. "Hey, buddy," James said softly, extending his hand toward the dog. "It's okay, I'm okay." With permission granted, Max's demeanor transformed. He pressed closer to the bed, stretching his neck to sniff James thoroughly, as if conducting his own medical assessment. Whatever he found seemed to satisfy him because his tense posture relaxed slightly, and he settled into a sitting position beside the bed, his head level with James's hand. "He's been beside himself," Sarah said, taking the chair on the other side of the bed. "Pacing, whining, refusing to eat. The moment the ambulance took you away, he planted himself by the door and wouldn't move, not even for treats. It was only when I got the call from Dr. Patel saying we could visit that he finally seemed to understand we were coming to you." James stroked Max's head, the familiar texture of the dog's fur under his fingers more comforting than any medication. "I'm sorry I scared you, boy. I didn't mean to leave without saying goodbye." Max whined softly, pressing his head more firmly against James's palm as if to say, "Don't do it again." "Doctor?" "Patel says you're staying overnight," Sarah said, her eyes taking in the IV lines and monitoring equipment with professional assessment. "How's the pain now?" "Manageable," James replied, not wanting to worry her further. "Better since they adjusted the medication." Sarah nodded, though her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced by his downplayed response. "I brought some things from home for you." She lifted a small bag onto the bed. "Toothbrush, a change of clothes for tomorrow, and this." She pulled out the journal she had given him for Christmas. The sight of the leather-bound book brought a lump to James's throat. He had been writing in it regularly, filling its pages with memories, reflections, and increasingly instructions for Max's care after he was gone. It had become a project of both practical and emotional significance, a way to ensure that whoever looked after Max would understand his quirks, his preferences, his history. "Thank you," he said, taking the journal from her, "for thinking of this and for bringing Max. It means more than I can say." Sarah's eyes softened. "I know how important he is to you, and you to him." Max, as if understanding he was being discussed, shifted position to place his chin on the edge of the mattress, his soulful eyes fixed on James's face with unwavering attention. A nurse appeared in the doorway, her eyebrows lifting in surprise at the sight of a large German shepherd in her patient's room. "I'm sorry, but visiting hours are ending soon." James felt a stab of panic at the thought of being separated from Max again so soon. Sarah must have read it in his expression because she immediately stood up. "Actually, we have permission from Dr. Patel for the dog to stay overnight," she said firmly, using what James had come to recognize as her professional nurse voice. "He's a certified service animal," she added, stretching the truth slightly as she gestured to Max's vest. The nurse hesitated, clearly weighing the unusual request against hospital protocol. Max, sensing the precariousness of the situation, sat up straighter and gave his most dignified, well-behaved appearance. "I'll need to check with the charge nurse," the nurse finally said, "but if Dr. Patel approved it." She left the sentence hanging as she retreated from the room. "Do you think they'll let him stay?" James asked, his hand still resting on Max's head. Sarah's smile held a touch of mischief. "Let's just say I've worked in enough hospitals to know how to navigate the system, and Dr. Patel really did say Max would be beneficial to your recovery. We just might need to bend a few rules about overnight visitors." James felt a rush of gratitude so intense it momentarily overwhelmed the pain and worry of the day. "Thank you for fighting for him. For us." "Always," Sarah replied simply, the single word carrying a weight of promise that settled around James like a blanket. Outside the window, the city lights twinkled against the winter darkness, a reminder of the world continuing its rhythms beyond the hospital walls. But within the small room, time seemed suspended in a moment of connection. Three souls bound by circumstance, choice, and something deeper than either. February arrived with a deceptive gentleness, bringing blue skies and winter sunshine that belied the bitter cold. James sat in Dr. Patel's office once again, Max at his feet, both of them waiting for the doctor to return with the latest scan results. The emergency hospitalization in January had marked a turning point, not just in James's treatment plan, but in his thinking about the time he had left. The door opened, and Dr. Patel entered, his expression carefully neutral as he took his seat behind the desk. James had come to know that look well. It was the face of a doctor preparing to deliver difficult news while maintaining professional composure. "The treatment is no longer effective, Doctor," Patel said without preamble, his direct approach a kindness in its own way. "The tumors have begun to grow again, and there are new metastases in the liver." James nodded slowly, absorbing the information. It wasn't unexpected. He had felt the change in his body, the return of symptoms that had briefly abated during the initial treatment success. Max, sensing the gravity of the moment, pressed closer to his leg, a warm, solid presence against the chill of the news. "What are my options?" James asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil beneath. Dr. Patel leaned forward slightly. "We could try a different combination of drugs. There's a new protocol showing some promise in similar cases. But I need to be honest with you, James. Given how aggressive your cancer has become, the likelihood of a significant response is low, and the side effects would be substantial." "How substantial?" "Potentially severe. Increased nausea, fatigue, possible neurological effects. It would almost certainly reduce your quality of life in the short term, with only a modest chance of extending your time." Max whined softly, his eyes moving between the two men as if following the conversation. James rested his hand on the dog's head, drawing comfort from the familiar texture of his fur. "And if I choose to stop treatment?" Dr. Patel's expression softened further. "Then we focus entirely on palliative care, managing your symptoms, keeping you comfortable. Based on the current progression, I would estimate you have 4 to 6 weeks. 4 to 6 weeks. The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. James had known this moment would come, had prepared for it intellectually, but hearing it stated so concretely still sent a jolt through him. "I need some time to think," he said finally, "to talk with Sarah." "Of course," Dr. Patel agreed, "but I would advise not waiting too long. Your strength is still relatively good now, which gives us more options for pain management and general care. If you decide to continue treatment, we should start soon." James nodded, his mind already racing ahead to practical matters. 4 to 6 weeks. Would it be enough time to finalize Max's arrangements? To say the goodbyes he needed to say? To finish the journal that had become so important to him? The journey home was quiet, James lost in thought, Max unusually subdued beside him in the taxi. Sarah had wanted to accompany them to the appointment, but an emergency at the hospital had kept her on shift. She would be coming over later after work, eager to hear the news that James now dreaded sharing. As they entered the apartment, James was struck by how much the space had changed over the past months. Sarah's presence was everywhere, her books on the shelves, her favorite mug in the dish rack, the extra blanket she liked draped over the arm of the couch. She had never officially moved in, but she spent most nights there now, claiming it was easier than constantly going back and forth to her own apartment. Max followed James to his favorite chair by the window, settling at his feet with a soft sigh. Outside, the winter sun was beginning its early descent, casting long shadows across the park. James watched a young couple with a dog, a golden retriever, exuberant and bouncy, playing fetch in the snow-covered field. The sight brought a bittersweet pang to his chest. "Remember when you used to run like that, buddy?" he murmured to Max. "Emily would throw that blue ball for you, and you'd bring it back every time. Never got tired of it." Max lifted his head at Emily's name, his ears perking forward as if he might catch a glimpse of her somewhere in the room. Even after all this time, he recognized her name, associated it with happiness and love. "She'd be proud of you," James continued, his voice growing thick. "So proud of how you've taken care of me, just like you took care of her." The German Shepherd shifted closer, pressing his warm flank against James's legs as if offering comfort for the emotion he heard in his human's voice. They remained like that for a long time, man and dog in quiet communion as the daylight slowly faded. James's thoughts wandered through memories and possibilities, weighing options that didn't feel like choices at all. By the time he heard Sarah's key in the lock, he had reached a decision. Max's ears perked up at the sound of the door opening, and he rose to greet Sarah with his customary gentle enthusiasm. She knelt to receive his welcome, murmuring affectionate nonsense to him before looking up to meet James's eyes. "How did it go?" she asked, her expression hopeful but cautious. "Not as well as we'd hoped," James replied honestly. "The treatment has stopped working. The cancer is growing again." Sarah's face fell, though she quickly tried to mask her dismay. "What did Dr. Patel suggest?" "Another treatment protocol, more aggressive, or palliative care." She crossed the room to sit on the arm of his chair, close enough that he could smell the antiseptic hospital scent still clinging to her scrubs. "And what are you thinking?" James took a deep breath. "I'm thinking it's time to stop fighting, to focus on the quality of whatever time I have left, rather than trying to stretch it out at any cost." Sarah nodded slowly, her hand finding his and squeezing gently. "How much time?" 4 to 6 weeks, approximately." Her intake of breath was sharp but controlled, professional training kicking in perhaps, or simply the result of having prepared herself for this moment since his diagnosis. "Are you sure about not trying the new treatment?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Even if the chances are low." "I'm sure," James interrupted gently. "I've been through this before with Emily. Watched her suffer through treatments that only prolonged her dying, not her living. I don't want that for myself, or for you and Max to witness." At the mention of his name, Max moved closer, positioning himself so he could rest his head on James's knee while still maintaining contact with Sarah. The gesture was so perfectly attuned to both their needs that James felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I understand," Sarah said softly, "and I'll support whatever decision you make. We both will." She stroked Max's head, her fingers brushing against James's where they rested in the dog's fur. "Thank you," James said, the simple words inadequate for the depth of his gratitude. "But there's something else we need to discuss. Something important." Sarah looked at him questioningly, her dark eyes reflecting the last of the day's light. "Max," James said simply, "I need to know he'll be taken care of, properly, by someone who understands him, loves him." Understanding dawned in Sarah's expression. "James, I know it's a lot to ask," he continued, needing to get the words out before his courage failed him. "You have your own life, your career. Taking on an 8-year-old German Shepherd with arthritis and separation anxiety isn't something anyone would choose. But he knows you, trusts you, and you know him, his quirks, his needs, what makes him happy. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. You don't need to ask. I've been hoping you would let me take him. I love him too, you know. Both of you. The last 3 words hung in the air between them, carrying a weight of meaning that neither had directly acknowledged before. James felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of a knot he hadn't fully recognized was there. I've been writing everything down, he said, gesturing toward the journal on the side table. His favorite toys, his commands, the story of how Emily picked him out of the litter. Everything I could think of that might help whoever took him after. But I always hoped it would be you. Max, as if understanding the significance of the conversation, looked between them, his intelligent eyes moving from one face to the other. Then, with deliberate care, he stretched up to place one paw on Sarah's knee, the other remaining on James's, physically connecting them. The gesture broke the tension, drawing startled laughs from both humans. I think he's making his preference clear, Sarah said, wiping away a tear with her free hand. He always was the smartest one in the room, James agreed, his own eyes damp but his heart lighter than it had been since leaving Dr. Patel's office. Outside, the first stars of evening were appearing in the darkening sky. Inside, in the gathering shadows of the apartment, 3 souls bound by circumstance and choice looked toward an uncertain future, together, for as long as they had. March arrived with unexpected gentleness, bringing milder temperatures and the first tentative signs of spring. Crocuses pushed through the melting snow in the park across the street, their purple and yellow heads nodding in the breeze. From his hospital bed, positioned near the window of his apartment, James could just make out these harbingers of renewal, a reminder that the world would continue its cycles long after he was gone. The hospital bed had been Sarah's idea. As James's mobility declined and his pain increased, the practicalities of care had become more challenging. The bed, with its adjustable positions and easy access for the visiting nurses, had made a significant difference in his comfort. Initially, James had resisted. It seemed like surrendering somehow to allow such a clinical piece of equipment into his home. But practicality had won out over pride, as it increasingly did these days. Max had adapted to the new arrangement with his usual grace. Unable to jump up and lie beside James as he had on the regular bed, the dog had taken to positioning himself directly underneath, like he had during Emily's final days. From this vantage point, he could maintain constant contact, occasionally poking his head out to check on James or accept a gentle pat. Today was a relatively good day. The pain was present but muted, thanks to the carefully calibrated medication that Dr. Patel had prescribed. James's mind was clear enough to appreciate small pleasures. The sunlight streaming through the window, the comforting weight of the leather journal on his lap, the sound of Sarah moving quietly around the kitchen. Dr. Patel was due to visit soon. Since James had decided to stop treatment, the doctor had arranged for home visits, sparing James the increasingly difficult trips to the hospital. It was a kindness that went beyond professional obligation, one of many that James had come to appreciate in these final weeks. "Are you up for some company later?" Sarah asked, entering the room with a cup of tea. She had taken a leave of absence from the hospital, using accumulated vacation time to be with James full-time. Mrs. Abernathy asked if she could stop by, and the doorman, Miguel, sent up some of his wife's soup. James smiled, touched by the continued thoughtfulness of his neighbors. "Mrs. Abernathy is always welcome, and please thank Miguel for me." Sarah set the tea on the bedside table, then leaned down to check on Max. "How's our guardian doing today?" "Vigilant as ever," James replied, glancing down to where Max lay beneath the bed. "He barely left to eat breakfast." Sarah's expression softened as she straightened up. He knows his job. There was a gentle knock at the door, and Sarah went to answer it. Dr. Patel entered, medical bag in hand, his expression warming as he caught sight of James by the window. "Mr. Sullivan," he greeted, moving to the bedside. "How are you feeling today?" "Better than yesterday," James answered honestly. "The new pain management protocol seems to be working." Dr. Patel nodded, pleased. "Excellent. And where is our furry friend?" As if on cue, Max emerged from beneath the bed, acknowledging the doctor with a dignified nod of his head, before settling into a sitting position beside Sarah. "Ah, there he is," Dr. Patel said with genuine affection. "Still on duty, I see." The examination was brief but thorough. Blood pressure, heart and lung sounds, a check of James's increasing jaundice, questions about pain levels and other symptoms. Throughout, Max watched attentively, his eyes following the doctor's every move with keen interest. "The hospice nurse will be here tomorrow," Dr. Patel said as he finished, packing away his stethoscope. "She'll help adjust your care plan as needed. And of course, I'm available by phone anytime." James nodded, grateful for the support system that had formed around him. "Thank you, Doctor. Not just for the medical care, but for understanding about Max, about what he means to me." Dr. Patel's expression softened. "In my years of practice, I've come to recognize that medicine is only one part of healing, or of dying well for that matter. The connections we maintain, the love we give and receive, these are equally important." Max, as if sensing he was being discussed, moved closer to the bed, his eyes meeting the doctor's with an intelligence that never failed to impress. "You know," Dr. Patel continued, addressing Max directly, "in medical school, they teach us to maintain professional distance, to avoid becoming too emotionally invested in our patients. But no one ever teaches us what to do when a patient's dog looks at us like that, like they understand everything we're saying and are holding us accountable for every promise we make." Sarah laughed softly. "He does have that effect on people." After Dr. Patel left, promising to return in 3 days, James turned his attention back to the journal in his lap. He had been writing in it daily, sometimes just a few lines when his strength was low, other times pages of memories and reflections when clarity allowed. Today he had a specific entry in mind. "Sarah," he called softly, "could you come here for a moment?" She appeared in the doorway, a question in her eyes. "I've written something I'd like you to read," he said, holding out the journal. "About Max, about you, about all of this." Sarah approached, taking the journal with gentle hands. "Now, are you sure?" James nodded. "I want you to read it while I can still answer any questions, while we can still talk about it." Understanding dawned in her expression. She settled into the chair beside his bed, opened the journal to where he had marked it, and began to read silently. Max, sensing the importance of the moment, emerged fully from beneath the bed to sit between them, his head swiveling from one to the other as if monitoring their reactions. James watched Sarah's face as she read, saw the play of emotions across her features, the way her eyes brightened with unshed tears at certain passages, the small smile that curved her lips at others. When she finally looked up, her eyes were wet, but her expression was steady. "James," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," he assured her. "I just wanted you to know, to understand what these months have meant to me, what you've meant to me." Max whined softly, pawing gently at James's arm where it rested on the bed. James shifted his hand to scratch behind the dog's ears, a gesture of reassurance. "He knows, doesn't he?" Sarah said, watching their interaction. "That you're getting weaker." James nodded. He knew with Emily too, before any of us were ready to admit it. The day passed quietly after that, Mrs. Abernathy visited briefly, bringing homemade cookies and cheerful gossip about the building's residents. James ate a small bowl of Miguel's wife's soup, finding it surprisingly appealing despite his diminished appetite. Sarah read aloud from the novel they had been working through together, her voice creating a soothing backdrop as the afternoon light shifted across the room. By evening, James was exhausted, the good day taking its toll nonetheless. Sarah helped him with his medications and the necessary adjustments to make him comfortable for the night. Max remained ever present, his attentiveness increasing as James's energy waned. "You should get some rest too," James told Sarah as she finished arranging his pillows. "You've been on your feet all day." She smiled, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead with tender familiarity. "I will. Just going to tidy up the kitchen first." After she left the room, James turned his gaze to Max, who sat alertly beside the bed, his eyes never leaving James's face. "You'll take care of her, won't you, buddy?" James murmured. "When I'm gone, she'll need you." Max's ears perked forward at the sound of James's voice, his head tilting slightly as if considering the question. Then, with deliberate movement, the dog rose and retrieved something from the corner of the room. The worn blue ball that had been Emily's favorite to throw for him, a relic from their life before. James watched, puzzled, as Max carried the ball to the bed and gently placed it on the mattress beside James's hand. Then the dog sat back, looking expectantly from the ball to James's face. Understanding dawned slowly. Max was offering his most prized possession, the last tangible connection to Emily, a treasure he had guarded jealously since her death, as if to say, "I kept this safe for her. I'll keep Sarah safe for you." The gesture, so simple yet so profound, broke something open in James's chest. Tears slipped down his cheeks as he picked up the well-loved ball, its surface worn smooth by years of retrieval games. "Thank you," he whispered to Max. "Thank you for everything." When Sarah returned, she found James asleep, his hand still curled around the blue ball, Max standing guard beside the bed with unwavering vigilance. The decline, when it came, was swifter than any of them had expected. 1 week after Dr. Patel's visit, James developed a fever that the antibiotics couldn't touch. His lucid periods grew shorter, the pain more difficult to manage. Through it all, Max remained a constant presence, leaving the bedside only when Sarah physically led him away for brief necessary breaks. On the 3rd day of the fever, Dr. Patel arrived for an unscheduled visit, alerted by the hospice nurse's concerned report. His examination was gentle, but his expression grave as he spoke quietly with Sarah in the hallway. Max, who would normally have followed Sarah, refused to leave James's side, his body pressed against the bed, as if physically anchoring James to the world. When they returned to the room, Dr. Patel approached the bed with professional composure that didn't quite mask his personal concern. "James," he said softly, unsure if his patient was conscious enough to hear him, "we're going to adjust your medication to make you more comfortable." To everyone's surprise, James's eyes fluttered open, surprisingly clear despite the fever. "It's time, isn't it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Patel nodded, abandoning pretense with a patient who had always valued honesty. "Yes, I believe it is." "Good," James breathed, the single word carrying acceptance rather than resignation. "Sarah?" She moved immediately to his side, taking his hand in hers. "I'm here." "Max," James continued, his eyes seeking the dog. "Where's Max?" "Right here," Sarah assured him, reaching down to guide Max's head into James's line of sight. "He hasn't left you." The German shepherd whined softly, nosing at James's hand where it lay on the bed. With what seemed like tremendous effort, James lifted his fingers just enough to brush the dog's muzzle. "Good boy," he murmured, "the best boy." What happened next left an indelible mark on everyone present. Max, with gentle deliberation, placed his front paws on the edge of the bed, something he had never done before, and leaned forward to rest his head on James's chest. There he remained, his brown eyes fixed on James's face, his body completely still, except for the steady rhythm of his breathing. Dr. Patel, who had witnessed countless deaths in his career, felt his professional detachment crumble at the sight. Beside him, the hospice nurse wiped tears from her cheeks, not even attempting to maintain clinical distance. "He's listening to his heartbeat," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "He's comforting him." "He's saying goodbye," Dr. Patel corrected gently, understanding in that moment something profound about the bond between the man and his dog, on his own terms. James's hand moved one last time, coming to rest on Max's head in a final gesture of connection. His eyes closed, a peace settling over his features that had been absent during the feverish struggle of the past days. He died like that, with Max's head on his chest and Sarah's hand in his, slipping away so quietly that it was difficult to mark the exact moment of transition. Only Max seemed to know precisely when it happened. The dog lifted his head, looked directly into James's face for a long moment, then turned to Sarah with an expression of such human understanding that it took her breath away. Later, after the necessary arrangements had been made and James's body taken away, Dr. Patel found himself lingering in the apartment, reluctant to leave Sarah and Max alone with their grief. He watched as the dog moved methodically through the rooms, nose to the ground, as if searching for something or someone. "He's looking for James," Sarah explained, her voice hollow with exhaustion and sorrow. "He did the same thing after Emily died." "How long did it last?" Dr. Patel asked, professional interest mingling with genuine concern. "Days, weeks really, though less intensely as time passed." She watched Max's methodical search with tear-filled eyes. "I don't know how to help him understand." Dr. Patel considered this, thinking of his years of medical training, of the countless books and papers he had read on death and dying. None had prepared him for the sight of a dog mourning his person with such evident understanding and devotion. "I think he does understand," he finally said. "Better than many humans do. He knew it was coming. He said goodbye in his own way." Max returned to the living room, the blue ball clutched gently in his mouth. He approached Sarah and dropped it at her feet, then looked up at her expectantly. "I think," Dr. Patel continued, watching the interaction with new understanding, "he's telling you that life continues, that his job now is to take care of you, as James asked him to." Sarah knelt, picking up the worn ball with trembling hands. "Is that it, Max? Are we going to take care of each other now?" Max pressed his head against her shoulder, a gesture so reminiscent of how he had comforted James that fresh tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks, but mixed with the grief was a flicker of something else, gratitude perhaps, or the first fragile shoots of healing. Outside, the spring sun warmed the awakening earth, coaxing new life from ground that had seemed barren just weeks before. Inside, a woman and a dog began the delicate process of creating a new life together, bound by their shared love for the man who had brought them together, and by the unspoken promise to honor his memory by living fully, lovingly in the days ahead.